I'm looking for a small project that I can build for a couple of Christmas gifts for this season. And I found one in Woodsmith. It's these candle lanterns that we recently featured. What's nice about them is that you can have them inside or outside, depending on the finish that you want to use. Now for the issue, we made 2 of them out of cypress and 1 out of redwood. I have some redwood left over from another project, so I decided to make one of these, and I want to show you the process of how it's done. Now the first step in making our candle lantern is getting the project pieces that we need. I'm going to start with the 4 sides, but I'm actually going to work on all parts. Now what I have here, just to mix things up a little bit, is some reclaimed redwood that came from an old water tower. I like the way that it works because it's nice and soft, but it also has some really great attractive grain. Now on this particular piece, on the wide faces, I have a really nice straight quarter sawn surface. So I've resawn 2 of the pieces already here at the bandsaw. Now when you're working at the bandsaw to resaw the parts, I set the rip fence on the saw so that it's a little bit more than the final thickness that I need. So I have something set up here just a hair under 5/8 of an inch. When you're working and doing this, you want to make sure that both the fence and the blade are 90 degrees to the table. That's going to give you the most consistent cuts. Now I have a second piece of redwood here, but this one, the wide faces have kind of a, it's not ugly, but it's a less attractive flat sawn surface. But on the edges, you can see that I have really nice tight vertical grain. So for this one, I'm going to cut the pieces with the wide face down and create a bunch of strips and then glue them up once everything's all planed to final thickness. Now when you're resawing at the bandsaw, it's important to let the saw do the work. With a sharp blade and soft redwood like this, it goes pretty quick and you get a smooth cut. But you just don't want to overfeed it, which can lead to inaccuracy. Now you don't want to go just from the bandsaw straight to gluing up your panels. It's a good idea to take a quick stop, head back over to the joiner and planer, and clean up the faces. Not only does this bring your work pieces down to their final thickness, but it removes the saw marks as well. Now I have a couple of the panels already glued up, and one thing that I want to point out here is the amount of glue to use. Now I was of the old school where you just applied a lot of glue, clamped everything up, and took care of the squeeze out later on. Problem is that on soft redwood like this, that can leave some gouges as you pull away that glue. What instead you're looking for, what I have here, real thin beads of glue that are squeezing out. Not too much, but I know that there's enough glue in there to give me a solid joint. Now I'm using Titebond 3 here because it's a waterproof glue, and I like the color of it so that it blends well with the color of the redwood. Let's see how this works in action. What I'm going to do is apply a bead of glue on the 2 outer boards. I'm going to use a brush to make sure that I have a good coat on the entire surface. From this point, I'm concentrating on 2 things. I want the edges to be tightly pressed together, and I also want to make sure that each of the boards is perfectly level with each other. On thin stock like this, it's easy to go crazy with your clamping pressure. I'm going to start from the center and then work my way out. I just want to tighten it up until I see a little bit of glue squeezing out, and then feel to make sure that the boards are level. Really, we come to the hardest part, is waiting long enough for this glue to set up. That's why I like to try and save this kind of operation to the last thing to do in the shop for the day. Pick things up in the morning. As we've seen, the defining feature of this candle lantern is the way that the four sides slope up towards the middle. Now, doing that might seem complex, but it's actually pretty easy. What I have here are the 4 blanks that I need for the sides. What I've done is to tilt the table saw blade to match the slope that I'm looking for, which in this case is 3 degrees. So I've set a bevel gauge to 3 degrees and used that to tilt the saw blade as far as I need. Now 3 degrees when you look at it really isn't that much, but it makes a big difference. So what I'm going to do first is make a cut on one end of all the blanks. This will be the top end. Then I can move the miter gauge to the opposite side of the blade, set up a stop block, and cut all the parts to their final length with parallel bevels on each end, which is what is going to allow those pieces to tilt, but then also be flat on the top and bottom ends. Before moving away from the table saw, there's one other step that I want to point out, and that's to cut a dado on the inside face of all of the side pieces. That's going to hold the bottom later on. And you do this the exact same way. Just swap out the regular blade for a 1/4 inch dado blade. Now it's on to making the sides into their final shape. To do that, I'm going to start by making a template out of some plywood. That way I can refine the design, and I'm going to use this for several of the steps down the road as we go along. So the first thing that I did after making the template was to set it over the top of my blanks, and then I used a white colored pencil and traced the outside, this arc at the bottom, as well as the window on the inside. Then I went to the bandsaw where I cut away most of the waste along the edges and then that shallow arc. Right now, back at the workbench, I want to remove as much of the waste as I can from the window. And I can't really do that at the bandsaw. So what I am going to do is use a jigsaw right here at the bench. Now, one thing that I want to point out real quick is that I drilled starter holes in each of the corners of the window. Technically, you really only need one starter hole, but I find it's easier for me to be able to just cut by connecting the dots, so to speak, and not have to worry about trying to get smooth curves as I go around the corner. At this stage, we have most of the waste taken care of, both inside the window, along the sides, and the bottom. Now we want to clean that up and get it to its final shape. To do that, we're going to bring the template back into play, and I'm using double-sided tape to attach it to my blanks. Then here at the router table, I've installed a pattern bit with a bearing on the bottom side. And what I'll do is run the template along that bearing and clean up the long edges of the lantern sides, take care of the arc along the bottom, and then I can set it over the top and route around the inside of the window. And in a very short amount of time, I'll have all 4 of the sides perfectly identical. While we're here at the router table, I want to push what we can do with the template a little bit farther. Now, all these sides for the lantern are joined with miters. Typically, you'd see those cut at the table saw, but we can do that right here using a chamfer bit. The key here is that the bearing on the chamfer bit is going to follow along the template while we route a miter on the long edges. What's key here is making sure that you raise the bit high enough to be able to trim the entire thickness of the side. Now, removing a lot of material like this can put a lot of strain on the bit and the router, and I don't really want to do that. But I don't really want to mess with the bit height too much. So what I'm going to do for the first pass is to kind of freehand. We're going to keep the bearing away from the edge of the template. What that's going to do is cut away a lot of the waste material. Then I can come back for a second pass with the bearing riding on the edge of the template and creating a smooth, crisp miter.